So welcome to our workshop today, Help My Students Can't Research. I am really excited to have so many folks here today, and I hope that you will find this an interesting and engaging workshop. My name is Jane Hammonds. I'm an assistant professor in the university libraries. I'm the teaching and learning engagement librarian. You can email me at hammonds.73@osu.edu, and I'm happy to talk more with you about information literacy concepts if you have any questions or comments. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about some learning bottlenecks related to research or inquiry-based assignments or projects. And I want to mention, so as a librarian, the type of research that we talk about tends to be more along the lines of research assignments. But if you are someone that's more involved in more like field research or more empirical research, I do think the content today, most of the content should be relevant as well. Because what we're really going to be talking about is big picture ideas about why students might struggle with research and things that we can do as instructors. So just wanted to mention that really quickly as sort of the focus of the workshop today. I also wanted to take a mention to really take a moment to really mention that I struggled with the title of this workshop. I thought that the title as it was might draw attention from people. And I definitely wanted people to be interested in and want to attend the workshop. But I also found that I felt that it had a little bit of a deficit-minded approach, in terms of that it might be seen as in some way blaming students for not being able to do research well, for not having success with research. And I've really been working hard to try to avoid using deficit-minded language and taking a deficit-minded approach. So what I really hope to do is actually that this is going to be more focused on equity and an equity-minded approach, where what we're really going to be doing is trying not to blame students for any challenges that they might have about research, but instead thinking about and reflecting on what we do as instructors, as librarians, that may contribute to the challenges that students have with research and things that we can do to change our teaching practices and our approach to support all students' ability to succeed when it comes to research. So I did just want to make that mention really quickly before jumping into the content. All right, so when we think about research, what are some of the learning bottlenecks? And the term bottlenecks comes from work that has been done on the coding the disciplines model, which some folks might be familiar with. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. But by bottlenecks, we mean what are those places within a research project or assignment where students tend to get stuck? What are the things that we see students struggling with over and over again? We see significant numbers of students having difficulty doing particular research tasks or grasping specific concepts related to research. So that's really what we mean when we talk about learning bottlenecks. So to get us started thinking about learning bottlenecks, I wanted to give you a second to reflect a little bit on your own experiences with research and students. So you can reflect on what are some of the ways that students struggle to meet your expectations for research assignments. Another way to think about this is to think about those students that do really well when it comes to research projects or assignments. What are the things that they do, or what are the things that they seem to understand that other students don't? So I'll give you just a few seconds to reflect on that. If you would like to share in the chat, you can. It is not at all required. But we'll just pause here and let everyone think about this a little bit about, how either students struggle with this or what students do really well that, other students don't. And before we move on, is there anything that anyone would like to share? Again, you can share in the chat, or if you want to unmute, you can share as well. Just check to make sure. So Rachel shared, students don't understand the difference between university, college, libraries, librarians, and their public school library experiences. Yes, and so they don't know how to ask for help or if they should. Yes, I think that's a really good point. Rebecca shared, thinking it's just as good to use Google Scholar as an academic databases, having challenges with search terms too narrow or too broad. Yes, some students tend to summarize each source that they want to integrate in their papers instead of synthesizing them within their argument. Yeah, I think that's a really key point. Absolutely. Let's see. They still use the same crappy internet searches they've always used instead of taking advantage of OSU resources. Yes. Shifting through information overload that's available to them, finding reputable references, being able to critically evaluate references, critical evaluation. Yes, absolutely. Judy shared they focus on the required number of results rather than reading ahead to inform their work. Yes, so that focus on those very objective criteria. Rebecca shared some students just get Boolean searching, but some can't find anything at all. Yes, developing a cohesive narrative that is supported by evidence. Yeah, these are all great examples of the kinds of challenges that students might have related to research. So thank you all so much for sharing those as great examples. So why is it that students have those struggles? You know, why do students seem to so often struggle with research assignments or research projects? Well, one of the things that I want to highlight really specifically is that research is really hard, right? Research is not an easy process. There are so many things that students have to know and have to understand to be able to research well. This is an image of the research process that we put together in the university libraries, and it goes from a starting point and maps all of the different things that students might have to do as part of the research process, from defining a research question, figuring out where to search, evaluating those sources, determining whether those sources actually answer the question that you have, putting them all together. And, as one person who saw this mentioned, it should be even more complicated, right? There should be lines going off the map and going all over the places and circling back and going forth, right? So research is really hard. And, learning all of this, some students are going to come in to Ohio State or to your university with a background that's going to better prepare them to take all of these steps, and some students are not. I know that this is something that we all know, but I also think it's a point that's really worth reiterating once again, that this is something that is really easy to do. Oh, that's okay, Elizabeth, no problem. All right. So, we know when it comes with research that there can be a significant expert novice gap. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of threshold concept theory, which was developed by Mayer and Land. And the basic theory is that there are certain ideas or understandings or ways of thinking that act as thresholds or like portals. And once you pass the threshold or pass through that portal, you start thinking more like an expert in your particular field, right? So it's the difference between studying history and thinking like a historian, acting like a historian, or thinking or doing or behaving like a scientist. And a key point related to this is that once you have crossed that threshold, it's really difficult to continue to see things from the perspective of someone who hasn't, right? Certain things just become natural to you. Certain things just become, tacit. You no longer have to explain why you're doing something because it's just how things are done, right? And so as a result of that, crucial steps can be missed when we are talking about research with our students. We're describing what they need to do. Certain things become invisible to us and may not be explicitly discussed. And some students will be able to pick up on what those things are, but some students will not if we don't explicitly tell them about those things. And nothing, is malicious in this. We're not setting out to cause problems for students. It's just that because we're experts, we just don't see all of the steps anymore, right? If you go back to this research process map, we are able to skip a lot of these steps, right? How many times do many of us really have to come up with a completely new research question? Or is our research question based on the work that we have previously been doing already, right? How many of us have to think about where to go to find information in our field? We know the journals, we know the databases, right? And so that expert novice gap can create that, those misunderstandings in those places where there's something that students are missing and we think we are being really clear, and that creates that frustration on both sides. There's research out there looking, into the effort that students do put into research assignments. And obviously, yes, there will be some students who, maybe they just don't care and they don't put much effort in. But a lot of times students really are putting in a legitimate effort, but they're just not clear what the expectations are, or they're just not clear the process that they're supposed to take. And so sometimes that gets to the point I think that Judy made, right, that they tend to focus in on those things that are understandable to them, like what are the required number of sources? What is the font that it needs to be? Those kinds of things, because those are at least understandable things to them, because the other expectations seem vague or unclear to them. So I want to highlight a few specific categories of research bottlenecks. So we're going to talk very briefly about emotional bottlenecks that students might have related to research. We're going to highlight some of the specific examples or misconceptions or knowledge gaps that students might have. And then we're going to talk about some of the challenges that students might have with specific tasks that are related to research. So I'll pause there really quickly and see comments or questions that folks have. Philip added in the chat, I've heard this called the curse of knowledge. Yeah, I think that's a great phrase. Philip, right? That the more we know, the harder it becomes to explain what we know to someone else. Absolutely. Any other questions or comments that folks have really quickly before we jump into talking about emotional bottlenecks that students might have? All right. So I wanted to just think a little bit about some of the emotions that students might have toward research. I'm going to put in the chat a bunch of links. And one of those links you should see to a Jamboard. So we're going to do this as a Jamboard activity. And so what I would like you to do is go ahead and click on that link. Go ahead and go out to that Jamboard. It is go.osu.edu/help-research. You can go out to that Jamboard and we're going to try to think about two questions. First, what are the types of emotional responses that students might have about research? And second, how might those emotional responses impact their performance on such assignments? So I'm going to go ahead and get out of this and go ahead and go into the Jamboard. So sorry, on the wrong page here. So if you haven't added to a Jamboard before, the easiest way to do that is to go over here on the left-hand side, create a sticky note that will pop up with a sticky note. And you can type your answer in there and just post it to the Jamboard. All right, so the questions there are, what are the emotional responses that students might have? And then how could these responses impact their performance? I'll give folks just a few more seconds to respond. And again, yeah, you can also write your response directly onto the Jamboard as well. All right, lots and lots of great responses coming in. And you can see the responses around the emotional reactions that students might have. Most of the responses that we're seeing tend to be fairly negative, right? Dread, anxiety, futility, stress, fear, right? Uncertainty, self-doubt, right? So students might have very strong emotional reactions when it comes to research. And, they don't always have to be the case, but they can often be negative reactions. Someone did add excitement. Yeah, and there are definitely, some students may be excited about the idea of research, looking into a topic more. But, there also might be those very strong negative reactions that students might have. And then, how could that impact their performance, right? They might avoid it, right? They might never start. Procrastination, we see that on there, right? So they're going to, do whatever they can to avoid it. And, at the last minute, do whatever they can. And that's all they're going to do because they let that self-doubt and that anxiety and that fear overwhelm them. They might, be scared to ask for any help or clarification. They might have a lot of frustration. They might avoid admitting even what they're feeling, right? So avoidance, procrastination, someone put ChatGPT. Yeah, they might turn to ways of completing their assignment that are not appropriate. There's definitely research out there that says when students are feeling more stressed, anxious, depressed, they're more likely to cheat. right? Absolutely. And so they might turn to a tool like ChatGPT. Absolutely. They might give up, right? So once they hit one dead end, that's it. Absolutely. Not taking any risks or trying new things. That's a great response as well. Because I'm so worried about this and so concerned and have so much anxiety, I'm not even going to try. I'm going to, go to a topic that I understand. I'm going to focus on that, and I'm going to do just that. Absolutely. Blame the prof for giving a hard assignment. Yeah, absolutely. Um, right. So thank you so much. These were all great, great responses to thinking about the kinds of emotional reactions that students might have to research assignments. So I'm going to try to go ahead and go back to our presentation. Hopefully folks are seeing the PowerPoint slides again. If not, please do someone let me know if it's ever I'm talking about something that doesn't seem to align with what you all are seeing. All right. So as folks mentioned, tons of different reactions that folks might have, ranging from dread to hostility, uncertainty, anxiety. But there might be some students that have, optimism, excitement, curiosity. But it can be based on, I've always done poorly on research assignments, or I just don't see the point of this assignment, or I just don't understand what I'm supposed to do. And that could create all of those negative emotions about dread and hostility, uncertainty, fear that students might have. Right. And one of the things I think that's important to keep in mind is that students might have emotional reactions to the process of research itself, right? How to go about doing the research, but they also might have emotional reactions to the content that they are researching, right? So my background is in history. We would be asking students to research really topics that are really heavy: the Holocaust, slavery, war. All of those could have a really strong emotional impact on the students as they are diving into looking at some of the worst aspects of humanity, right? And there are other, I'm sure that all of you can think of, whatever your field is, topics that could be really controversial, that could have a really negative impact on students. One of the things that we talk about is to make research assignments more meaningful to students is to allow them to research topics that they're really interested in. But that could also lead them to having a stronger emotional connection and a stronger emotional reaction to the research itself. And I think, in the library literature, there's been a little bit of discussion of this that's been talking about the fact that we've tended to divorce the emotional aspect of research from the research process, which I think is not the right way to go about doing that. So I think it's important to emphasize that emotions are a natural part of the research process. And that's something that we want to think about as instructors when we think about how we go about, how we approach teaching our students how to research. Right. So I want to talk a little bit later on about some strategies that you can use to think about dealing with emotional reactions. But I wanted to highlight those as some examples of the way that emotion might impact research. Pause there really quickly to see if there are any questions or comments. So Judy shared, sometimes when they get to choose their own topic, they get so tied to it, they don't see if it's too narrow or that there aren't any credible sources available. Yes, that is a really important point as well, Judy. They may go into this thinking, I need to prove myself right. And so that's how I'm going to that's going to be the goal of this assignment, is to make sure that what I'm finding aligns with what, I already think and what I see to be true. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so for this part, I want to talk a little bit about some of the types of misconceptions or knowledge gaps that students might have related to research. So students might have misconceptions, first of all, just about the process of research or the purpose of research. Especially coming from high school backgrounds, students might think about research as a process of just compiling information on a topic, right? Rather than as a more inquiry-driven process that's intended. I think Jua had mentioned in the chat, like having students synthesize their sources and bring them together. Students might not see or understand that that's a purpose that we often have about research. Students may lack key conceptual understandings that many of us have developed about research just because of our experience doing research ourselves. Even if they're not things that we explicitly have realized, we've implicitly recognized these things and they impact our expectations. So to think about this discussion question, feel free to share your response in the chat if you would like, not at all required. But why do we tend to require students to incorporate multiple sources rather than relying on just one source? So if anyone wants to share a response to that in the chat, you feel free to do so. I'll pause for a second. Right, we want them to synthesize, not summarize, to learn multiple perspectives, to extend their viewpoints. With just one source, the danger of them just repeating stuff is increased, right? They need to consider diverse perspectives on the issue, encourage multiple perspectives to get different opinions, right? To eliminate bias, multiple viewpoints, promote credibility, right? So students can understand different perspectives and possibly limit bias. Yeah, absolutely, right? So there are a lot of reasons why we expect students to use multiple sources, right? And for me and for many librarians, this comes back to a concept that we talk about a lot called scholarship as conversation, right? So we recognize as experienced researchers, experienced scholars, that each source represents only one perspective, right? And we know that whatever topic we're looking at, whatever question we're investigating, there are going to be multiple perspectives and multiple topics. So as researchers, it is our responsibility to investigate the conversation that has been taking place around our question or around our topic, right? And then this understanding of scholarship as this ongoing conversation impacts a lot of the expectations that we have for students with research assignments. So, why we expect them to use multiple sources, but also this idea that we expect them to contribute their own voice to the conversation, right? So that the goal of research, or one of the goals of research, is to find different sources, to bring those sources in conversation with each other, and to add our own voice or to add our own research findings into that conversation, right? And we also recognize that citations are an important part of, providing the record of that conversation. So that's one of the reasons why we so emphasize the importance of providing citations, right? So an understanding of this concept of scholarship as conversation is really key to a lot of the practices, the expectations that we have around research assignments. But we don't always explicitly talk about this with students. And I'll give a quick example. I actually just started a PhD program at Ohio State recently. And we were in class the other day and we were talking about this concept. And one of the students said, why did I never think about putting the authors in conversation with each other, right? And this was a student that's in a PhD program at Ohio State who had not thought of this concept before. It was, you could see it was a complete breakthrough, right? And, if this was a PhD student, how do we expect that our undergraduate students are going to come in with a grasp of this concept, right? So this is something that we need to talk about and explain with our students. This is something that could really create some of those misunderstandings or frustrations that we have when students lack an understanding of this concept. A couple other key concepts that I want to highlight. The idea of research as inquiry. This one is very closely related to the idea of scholarship as conversation. But as experienced researchers, we tend to think about research as this ongoing, conversation, this ongoing process, a collaborative process that is driven by questions within our particular field or across fields that we are still looking for the answer to, right? And we know that when we share our responses, we share our findings, that it's generally not going to be considered the one right answer. Instead, we know that the conversation is going to go on. People are going to continue asking questions, and, an understanding of this concept is really important. Thinking about something like developing a research question. I think this is something that's really hard for students to do. And that's because you really need to understand that when you're developing a research question, the goal is to think about what hasn't been answered yet, right? So it's not just to summarize what everyone else has done, but our research questions are really about what are the gaps in the literature. So first, we need to have an understanding of the conversation in our field, and then we need to know how to develop research questions based on the gaps in the literature. And that's really difficult to do. And if you haven't really thought about this idea of scholarship as conversation or research as a process of inquiry, it can be really difficult to grasp that idea of how you develop a research question. Right? And then one other key concept that I want to mention, there are other key concepts out there, but just a third one that I want to highlight is this idea of authority as constructed and contextual. And this really highlights this idea that why students might have trouble identifying appropriate research sources, right? Some folks mentioned in their comments about where students struggle is that they struggle to find the right sources. They struggle to evaluate sources. They don't know, they don't know why they shouldn't use Google Scholar and why they should use a database instead. And that goes to this idea of authority is constructed and contextual, that there are certain information sources, there are certain search tools that are considered more authoritative or appropriate to use as part of academic research. And, a student might immediately understand why those search processes that they've used and can continue to use in everyday life are perfectly fine, would not be considered to be appropriate by their instructors when it comes to academic research. Right. And so this is just another example of a key concept that I really wanted to highlight as something that may be completely, obvious to us as instructors, as librarians, but that for a student could be, completely new. And I know we probably all had examples. I know I had examples in the past where students would, for example, cite a website that was meant for children. And would not understand why that was not appropriate because it had the information that they were looking for, right? So those are some key concepts that I really just wanted to highlight as, things that create those misunderstandings or misconceptions around research. Let's see, got some knowledge, previous research, some responses, issues of concern to a particular community. Yes, great. Any other questions or comments related to sort of the misunderstandings or knowledge gaps that students might have? Using Google Scholar is not recommended. So that's a great question. There are concerns about Google Scholar in terms of the information or sources being in there from proprietary journals, those kinds of things. But I don't necessarily think it's automatically a bad research tool. I tend to use Google Scholar quite a bit myself as part of my research. But there are, I think, particular fields or disciplines where it may be considered less appropriate to use. Certain instructors may have, I really want students to be using this database, resources from this journal. So, I think for me personally as a librarian, that's a bit of a mixed issue, but other folks may have different ideas about the appropriateness of Google Scholar. And if you have those and would like to share those, I think it's like anything else. It's a tool that can be valuable as part of the research process, but probably shouldn't be the only tool that you use. But I see some benefits to using it. And as I said, I use it myself along with other research tools. So Lexine shared, personally, I feel like databases provide more robust offerings than Google Scholar. Yeah. I think that there are definitely arguments that can be made for and against, but I would definitely, I personally would not completely ban the use of Google Scholar, nor would I tell students to only use it. Linan shared, right, Google Scholar is okay in my class. Students will need to evaluate the results carefully to make sure it meets requirements. Really a primary research paper as opposed to a book. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's, that's the same as well, in databases. Even if you click, for example, the peer-reviewed box in database, you can still get articles that are not peer-reviewed because the peer-reviewed option limits peer-reviewed journals, not necessarily peer-reviewed articles. So students, even in stuff that they find in database, will still have to do some evaluation. Mm-hmm. All right. So thinking about the tasks that students might have to do, what are some of the tasks that might create issues? Yeah, Rachel, I wonder if students would be less resistant to giving up on things like Wikipedia, Google Scholar, if we taught them how to mine those things for author names or references. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Mining Wikipedia articles, that's one of the ways that I use Google Scholar a lot is to do citation tracing, right? Because they offer the very quick, easy cite who has cited this article. And it may not be everyone, but normally I find one article and I find, 15 people that have cited that. And it allows me to expand the amount of research that I do. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. All right. So thinking about the tasks that students might struggle with. I was going to do this as a Jamboard, but I don't want to take too much time. So if you want to add into the chat any thoughts that you have on this. think about an assignment like an annotated bibliography. What are the things that students need to know to be able to do this task successfully? So if you want to take a minute and just list as many tasks as you can think of that a student would need to be able to do in order to be able to complete an annotated bibliography. And again, you can just add those in the chat rather than using the Jamboard. Right, so we have how to create a properly formatted citation, how to narrow a topic, what a good one looks like and what a bad one looks like, right? How to evaluate. How to know when they've looked in all the relevant places, how to summarize the content of the articles, when to stop gathering sources. Yes, that's a great point. How to write a summary, how each sources contribute to the research paper and how they relate it to each other, how to add an opinion, right? Pick a topic, identify a place to start, read the abstract, read the article, synthesize, format the citations. Yeah, right? So as these responses indicate, there's a lot that goes into being able to do an annotated bibliography. First, students just need to understand what the term annotated bibliography means. Do they know what a bibliography is? Do they know what an annotation is? Do they know what the purpose of an annotated bibliography is? Are they doing the annotated bibliography separately? Or are they doing it part of a additional research assignment? Right? So what is the goal of the annotated bibliography? How do they find their sources? How do they know which sources to include? How do they write a good annotation? Right? How do they cite their sources correctly? Lots of things are involved in being able to do an assignment like an annotated bibliography, which for an experienced researcher might not seem all that difficult, but each of those are places where students could get stuck along the way. They may be able to find sources perfectly well, but not know how to summarize them effectively. They may be able to, cite their sources, but they don't know when to stop. All of those things could create an issue for students. Right? So each research assignment can have numerous components. Students need to know how to complete a range of tasks in somewhat of an order, but also to recognize that it's really not a linear process at all. And they may have to go back and revise and change and go back again and narrow their research question or find new sources, right? And all of this may be complicated by, a lack of familiarity with academic jargon, right? The terms that we use, like annotated bibliography, are not everyday terms that students may be familiar with. And there may be disciplinary differences. Every time if you go out and look and see how do you do an annotated bibliography, they'll be like, oh, there's multiple ways to do this, right? And you have to think, okay, which is the way that my instructor actually wanted me to do, right? And of course, there can be lots of disciplinary differences in the search tools that are available, the types of sources that are appropriate to use, conventions for incorporating those sources, standards for citing sources, all of those kinds of things, right? And then I think there was something that I mentioned. Sorry. Oh, there was a slide that I had in there that I might have missed somehow. Anyway, sorry. Swear there was something else that I had. Maybe it'll pop up later, or maybe I moved it around by accident. So I just wanted to highlight that really quickly in terms of the tasks that students might have. Right. Teaching strategies. So before we jump into teaching strategies and resources, any questions that folks might have really quickly? So we'll go ahead and jump ahead. Juggling different citation styles. Yes, absolutely. MLA for one paper, APA for another. Absolutely. Sometimes they'll throw in Chicago style. That throws everything off. Yep, absolutely. Right. And we learn our citation styles. I can cite things in APA style without looking anything up unless it's a really kind of obscure source type. I don't have to look those things up. Right. But, students, don't have that same level of understanding, and that can be really challenging. Absolutely. So what are some of the strategies that we can take? So some of the steps that I'm going to talk about are based on the concept of decoding the disciplines, which is a model that was developed by Joan Middendorf and David Pace. And it's a model for thinking about how to narrow the gap between expert and novice thinking. You start by identifying a bottleneck, and then thinking about the middle tasks that students have to do, modeling those tasks, giving them time to practice and feedback, and giving them feedback on those tasks. And unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about the whole model today, but I did want to just highlight a few aspects of this as ways to get started, strategies that we can use to provide students with more guidance around research assignments. So the first task is to identify a bottleneck. So this is something that we already did earlier when you were talking about where are the places that students fail to meet expectations around research assignments. That's a great kind of question to get started in thinking about what a bottleneck is. So where are those places when students get stuck? What are the tasks that students tend to struggle with over and over and over again that we see? Right. So once you've identified that bottleneck, this is where you then go into this process of, okay, what is really involved in this? What are the tasks that students actually have to be able to do to complete this assignment? What are the understandings that students need to be able to do this assignment? We try to break our assignments down as much as we can as we're looking through them. And then we use that to identify those places where we may need to provide students with some additional support and think about how we can scaffold those assignments to give students more practice, in lower stakes environment, and to allow students to get feedback before they have to, turn in their final version of the assignment. So really just thinking about, how we can break those assignments down and think about what is actually involved in those assignments. So the actual decoding the disciplines process, if you're not familiar with it, recommends actually doing interviews with another faculty member or someone else who can ask you questions about your assignment and ask you questions about your discipline. If you're not able to do that, there are questions that you can just ask yourself, as you're going through and taking a look at your assignment. How would I actually do this? What would I do first? What would I do next? Trying to break it down into as small as steps as possible so you can start to get some of those things that you may miss the first time around because they seem natural to you. And then how do I know these things? How do I know where to start? How do I know what to do and what not to do? What kind of knowledge am I relying on about my discipline that students may not know? What kind of knowledge am I relying on about, academic research in general that students may not know? So thinking through these questions as we think about our research assignments, can be a really helpful way to start identifying some of those places where students might need some additional guidance. And then I also recommend using this in conjunction with the Transparency in Learning and Teaching Framework, or TILT. And this is a model that was developed by Marianne Winklemas and colleagues. And they've done some research on this that shows that students' performance on research assignments, especially students who come from more marginalized backgrounds, are improved if we are really clear about the purpose of the research assignments. So why students are actually doing this, how it connects to course goals, how it connects to previous assignments, how it connects to future assignments, what specific tasks that students are supposed to do, so step-by-step instructions if possible, and then how their students, how their work will be evaluated, what you consider to be the most important thing for determining students' grades. And this can be something where we think about how we lay out our research assignments. One of the things you often see with research assignments is that the first thing students will encounter are those things such as font, page limit, word limit. This will be a 10-page research paper that should be in 12-point font and so on. And that's often very highly, placed in the research assignment guidelines. And so it's no wonder that many students think that that is something that's really important for them, right? So thinking about the placement of that kinds of information when we put our assignments together. And I put here on the screen an example of from one of the classes that I taught where I have, the purpose, the task, the grading, the resources all clearly laid out. And this is in Canvas. And one tip that I can add is, if you haven't done this before, this is a great way if you're teaching in Canvas or whatever your learning management system is, create links back to those previous assignments or create links out to information that will be helpful to them, right? So for those students that need those, they're there and available. For those students that don't, then they don't have to click on those links. But that's I think a fairly easy way to help create those connections between past assignments with students or help them to see how it connects to something that they're doing in the future and to give them additional guidance in areas that they may need. Right? So if you're interested in learning more about decoding and TILT, I have tons of resources on them. I'm going to share a few at the end, but I have lots more. So please let me know, and I'm happy to share additional resources on those two models. I did have a quick activity really quickly that I just wanted to think about in terms of thinking about the words that we use on our assignments. So these are some of the common verbs that we tend to use in research assignments. So we tell students to analyze things, we tell students to explain, we ask them to identify, we ask them to interpret. So which of these verbs matches which definition? And so for the sake of time, why don't we just do explain, right? So if we're thinking about explain, which of these definitions is actually what we want students to do when we talk about explaining? So if anyone wants to share in the chat whether they think explain matches better with 1, 2, 3, or 4, you can feel free to share your responses. Are we asking them to conclude or determine? Are we asking them to point out and make known? Are we asking them to clarify? Or are we asking them to break down the topic into its parts? So we'll give some additional responses time just in case folks want to respond. So it looks like most folks are aiming toward 3. Judy also has 3 or 4. We have 4. Lorian says 3, but could also be 4 as well. So we've got, even, amongst the responses that we have here, most folks seem to be leaning toward 3, but some folks are like, hey, it could also be 4 as well. Right. And I remember when I put this together a couple of weeks ago and I was looking at it again, and I'm like, am I sure which one it is myself? Right. Bethany said it could maybe be 2 as well. And Judy as well. I could also see someone making a case for 2. And I think that is absolutely right. I think that you could make cases that a lot of these match to these different verbs. Right. So how clear are we always when we use these terms like analyze and explain and identify? Are we sure that students really are interpreting these words the same way that we mean them? Because I think that several of these, could potentially match several different words. And so it's not always clear, I think, to a student what the difference between identifying and interpreting are, or explaining and identifying might be. So if we give some guidance around specific verbs that we're using, that is something that could potentially be really, really helpful for students. So that's actually, this is the slide that I thought I had earlier, right? So just, as a reminder that we use a lot of jargon that could be really confusing to students. And words that have a very particular meaning for us, like journal, could have a very different meaning for students. They can have different non-academic meanings. So as much as possible, making sure that we're clarifying our jargon. This is another way that you can use Canvas links. If you use a term like journal or scholarly or peer review, provide a link to a video that takes students out so that they can take a look at that if they're not sure what you mean by peer review. And other students that already get that, they don't have to click on those links. Think carefully about the verbs that we're using and maybe provide some guidance on what those verbs actually are asking students to do. I put a couple links in here to a couple of writing centers that have given good definitions of action verbs in research assignments. If you need that, would like to use that to help. All right. So as we get to the last, I just wanted to share a couple really quick resources and activities. Thinking back to the idea of emotion and research, there are a lot of ways that you can allow students to share their emotions that are related to research. Use a polling tool, have students share the top 3 words that come to mind when it comes to research assignments. Have students in a Canvas discussion board share an emoji or GIF. I've had students do song titles or book titles. I had a participant in one of my courses the other day that said, searching the internet, the title that matched was Everything Everywhere All at Once. I was like, yes, that's a perfect title that matches what it feels like to search the internet, right? So having these multiple check-in points where you can get some feedback on how students are feeling about the research process, where they may be really struggling. One of my friends would just have students send her one GIF as an email, and that would be it. If you see, okay, a lot of students are really struggling, maybe we need to pause and have a moment to talk about some of the reasons why students might be struggling with these. And it also helps students to know that they're not the only ones that have these feelings. A student may come and say, I'm the only one that doesn't get this. I'm the only one that's really anxious about this. Everyone else knows what they're doing already. And doing something like this can help students to see that no, it's natural to have these kinds of reactions to research assignments. And that's okay. And that's fine. That's part of the process. Interpreting a research assignment. This is an activity that I've recommended before. And there's different ways that you can do this, but, giving the students the research assignment and having them interpret it back to you, right? I underline the key verbs, circle the words that they don't understand, and then they can provide a quick summary. Here's what I think I'm supposed to do. Here's what I would do to get started with this assignment. Here's what I would not do as part of this assignment. And, this could be a pretty short activity, but could give you a lot of feedback on how they are actually reading your assignment and whether what you are thinking that they are going to be doing is the same as what they think they're supposed to be doing, right? And you could do this several times throughout the research process where you have this kind of check-in and let them give you feedback on what they think they're supposed to be doing. And, then you can, correct any misconceptions or misunderstandings that they might have. Lots of additional ways that you could identify misconceptions or bottlenecks. I've mentioned these before, and it seems really simple, but I have found true-false activities to be so helpful in identifying some bottlenecks or misconceptions that students might have. I give them 5 statements related to a research assignment, or like, what is a literature review, or what is whatever, process, type of assignment that you're doing, and have them tell me if they're true or false. And you can really identify some of the misconceptions that students have if you do something like this. Think aloud activities where you ask students to do something like evaluate a source and determine whether they would include it in their research paper. Have them talk aloud about how they would actually do that, or have them, visualize what they might do as their next steps in the research process. And again, that will give you place to get feedback like, okay, this student is describing an evaluation process that I just don't think is really relevant. And so that would give you a moment we can stop and talk about, okay, what are some better strategies that we could use to evaluate sources? Giving students analogies or having students develop their own analogies about the research process could give you an idea of how they think about and characterize research. Small teaching, if you're familiar with Small Teaching by James Lang, he talks about using the last or first 5 minutes of a class really effectively. And I think there's definitely ways that you could do this to have students practice skills relevant to the research project. So I mentioned, that I think developing research questions is something that's really hard to do. So you could take the last 5 minutes in class and say, okay, think about what we talked about today. What is a research question you could ask based on the content that we talked about today? Have them turn them in. And maybe the first time you do this, you might have a number of students who would give closed-ended questions. So when you come back into class, you could talk about, okay, here's some examples of research questions that students came up with. What's the problem with using a closed-ended question like this, right? And so they get that practice at the end of class, just 5 minutes, a couple times before they have to come up with their own research question, developing research questions based on the content that you've talked about. Or use those last 5 minutes, okay, think about what we talked about today, go out and find one scholarly article that is relevant to this and post a link to it in the chat. And you wouldn't have to give everyone feedback. You could go through and pick, 5 of the articles that they posted and see, are they finding articles that are relevant or not, right? So quick ways for you to see what they are doing and whether or not it aligns with what you're hoping for, but also giving them practice and those skills that you need them to do for that research assignment. I wanted to share in terms of resources, really specifically the Carmen modules that we have. Especially if you are from Ohio State, I definitely recommend that you take a look at some of these Carmen modules. I'm going to try to find them really quickly. Hopefully, folks are seeing this site. So we have developed Carmen modules that you can download into a course. And you can see that they are on a range of topics: how to do an annotated bibliography, a literature review, how to use Academic Search Complete or PubMed, how to cite sources and how to evaluate sources, reading a scientific article, synthesizing sources. So these are pre-made Carmen modules that can be added directly into a Carmen class, modified as needed, and then, can be support resources that are available to your students. So I highly recommend that if you're at Ohio State, you take a look at those, and you can put in a request. We'll send those modules directly to you. You can add those to your course. If you're not at Ohio State, it's a little bit more complicated, but if there's one that you're interested in, send me an email. We can talk about how we might get that information to you. All right, and then just a few more resources. I'm not really going to go into depth in these. You can take a look at these if any of these are resources. I've got various activities that you can use to help students do different parts of the research process. There's lots of tools out there. We have an instructor resources at university's library site. We have an information literacy guide on the Teaching and Learning Resource Center. So if any of these look like they would be helpful to you, highly recommend you going out and taking a look at any of those. All right, so we'll pause as we come to the end, references, attributions, all of that stuff. We will open this up to questions, comments, or thoughts that folks might have in the last couple of minutes. So Rebecca had no idea these Carmen modules existed. What a wonderful resource. Yes, absolutely. We think it's like an underutilized tool. We've been trying to promote them more and more, but to let everyone know that we have all of this pre-made content. We have more than 30 modules that have been created that you can download directly into your course. You can modify as needed. So yeah, please take a look at those. Oh, you've been making this stuff by scratch myself. Yeah, so absolutely, Rebecca, let us do that work for you. We've got a lot of stuff there, and if there are modules that you think are missing that are really relevant, let us know, and we're happy to think about how we can create additional modules for folks. So yeah, if there's something that's not there, let us know. Thank you, Mandar. Absolutely, yeah. So I am going to go ahead and stop the recording, but I will stick around in case there are questions, stop sharing, but I'll stick around in case there are additional questions, comments, or thoughts that folks have. All right, have a great afternoon.